The medication room at St. Michael's was a cathedral of order. Row after row of plastic bins, each labeled with pharmaceutical names that Katie Rodriguez had memorized in her sleep. Epinephrine. Atropine. Amiodarone. The vials arranged themselves by her hands, muscle memory, the kind that didn't forget even when you wanted it to. She was supposed to be invisible here. Just a temp nurse cycling through the VA wing. Nobody important. Nobody with secrets. Nobody with scars running up her forearms beneath long sleeves that never quite rode up. The fluorescent lights hummed their fluorescent hymn, that low electrical drone that never stopped, not at 6 a.m., not at midnight. She counted the hum as she worked. 1001. 1002. Counting was how she stayed present without feeling anything. Norfolk humidity pressed against the hospital windows, mid-September, already thick as a wet towel. Outside, the James River reflected the morning gray, indifferent, permanent. Katie's hands moved with terrifying precision. The hospital called it excellent work ethic. She knew it as the thing that had kept her alive in Kandahar. She'd been at St. Michael's for 19 days. 19 days of reviewing charts in the staff lounge alone, her sandwich untouched, her eyes tracking reflections in the window glass. Everyone who entered. Everyone who left. Everyone who might recognize the way she moved, like someone counting exits in case she needed to run. The physical therapist had called it kinetic awareness. The Marines had called it combat effective. She called it staying alive. The VA wing occupied the entire third floor. 12 beds. 8 currently occupied. Corporal James Chen occupied bed 7. She'd first seen his name in the admission records 2 days ago. Admitted 08 for 7 hours with acute abdominal pain. Presenting with previous shrapnel wound complication, Kandahar Province, 2019. Her hands had gone still for exactly 4 seconds. Then she'd kept reading. That was the discipline. Read. Assess. Move. Never acknowledge. James Chen had replaced her. She didn't know his face yet. The file photograph was 5 years old, a young man with a particular combination of exhaustion and determination that only came from field medicine. He'd been a combat medic, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. The battalion she'd left behind when they pulled her out for the undercover assignment. When they gave her new papers, new name, new hospital, new life. When they told her to watch him from a distance and report anything unusual. Katie pushed the crash cart down the 3rd floor corridor at 0630 hours. The wheels squeaked against linoleum, a sound like mice in the walls. Her name badge read, Katie Rodriguez, registered nurse. The photograph was a woman with her hair pulled back, neutral expression, 40 pounds lighter than she actually was. Pentagon forgery. Clean work. The card also said she'd worked at 3 different hospitals over 12 years. All fake. All verified. All perfect. She paused outside room 307. Corporal Chen's door stood ajar. Through the gap, she could see his shoulder, muscled, marked with what looked like surgical scarring. His arm lay atop the blue hospital blanket, a line threaded into the crook of his elbow. The monitor beside his bed pulsed its steady rhythm. 74 beats per minute. Normal sinus rhythm. Stable. She moved past. The medication room doors closed behind her with a soft pneumatic hiss. Katie began inventory on the 0700 morning supply. Morphine. Dilaudid. Oxycodone. She counted the opioid vials against the digital log. 43 milliliters on the shelf. 43 documented. The numbers matched exactly, the way they always did, the way they should. But the VA billing records didn't match. She'd accessed them the night before, alone in her apartment in the Ghent neighborhood, a 1-bedroom on Westwood Avenue, 12 miles from St. Michael's, far enough to disappear into but close enough to respond fast if the assignment required it. Her laptop, encrypted through a VPN routed through 3 military servers, had pulled the files in 40 seconds flat. The billing records told a different story than the medication logs. "You spend a lot of time in here." The voice came from behind her, smooth as oil on still water. For someone who's supposed to be afloat. Dr. Marcus Mercer stood in the doorway, his white coat pristine, his stethoscope draped across his shoulders like a trophy. He was 43, the hospital directory said. Cardiothoracic surgeon. VA billing specialist. Impressive credentials, spotless record, perfect smile. The kind of smile that meant he'd never considered the possibility that someone might not fold under his weight. Katie turned slowly. Her jaw was tight. Controlled breathing. The way she'd been trained to respond when threatened. "Morning rounds," she said. Her voice was steady, deferential. "Restocking after night shift." Mercer stepped inside the medication room. The space contracted around him, not physically, but the way air pressure changes before a storm. His eyes tracked her, the way a hawk tracks movement in grass. "You're always here early. Every shift. I've noticed." He smiled. "Dedicated. I respect that." Katie continued counting. 1, 2, 3. The VA patients especially, Mercer continued. He leaned against the counter, watching her hands. "You spend a lot of time reviewing their charts. Studying their medication schedules. Why is that?" "Best practice," Katie said. She didn't look at him. "Know the patient history. Prevent errors." Mercer laughed. Soft. Predatory. A sound like a tank idling in an empty garage. "Prevent errors. That's very thorough of you. Some might say paranoid." He picked up a vial of epinephrine, turned it in the light. "But I like thorough. Thorough nurses don't ask questions they shouldn't ask. Thorough nurses keep their heads down. Don't they?" She felt his meaning like a blade tip against her ribs. Subtle. Testing. "I'm just a nurse," Katie said quietly. He set the vial down exactly where it had been, then walked past her. Close enough that she felt the disturbance in air. 307 should be getting his post-op labs in about an hour. Make sure the bloods get to pathology. Make sure the paperwork is correct. He paused at the door. Make sure you don't notice anything unusual. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Katie heard his footsteps recede down the corridor. She waited exactly 90 seconds before she allowed her shoulders to drop half an inch. She'd been in enough combat zones to recognize threat assessment. Mercer didn't know what she was, not specifically. But he knew she was looking. And he was telling her to stop. The problem was, she already had found something. The VA billing records on her encrypted laptop told the story in numbers. Phantom procedures. Charges for surgeries that never happened, medications that never existed, diagnoses billed to insurance companies that had never treated those patients. Dr. Mercer had been running the numbers through the VA hospital system for almost 18 months. $42,000 per month. $504,000 per year. All of it funneled through procedures on patients like Corporal James Chen, who couldn't argue with documentation because they were too medicated to ask questions, and they trusted their doctors the way soldiers always did, with the kind of faith that came from survival. Katie finished her inventory at 0647. She updated the digital log. Everything perfect. Everything correct. Then she walked to room 307 and checked Corporal Chen's chart. Post-op day 3 from emergency appendectomy. That's what the note said. Emergency surgery at 2,314 hours on admission day. Surgical site clean. Vital stable. Medication schedule: morphine every 4 hours as needed, metoclopramide every 6 hours, antibiotics 4. Recovery proceeding normally. But she'd read his original admission file. Emergency appendectomy? He had no complaints of abdominal pain in his initial intake. His presenting complaint was the shrapnel wound complication from 5 years ago. The surgery notes that appeared in his file on day 2 of admission, those were added after he was already medicated. After he wouldn't remember the inconsistency. After he'd wake up with surgical scars and a bill he'd have to pay. That night, alone in her apartment, Katie unfolded the flag from her locker at St. Michael's. She kept it in a plastic sleeve, protected from dust and time and the tendency of things to decay. Military funeral flag. 3 folds, which meant 3 soldiers. The fabric was white with blue field, the edges perfectly creased even after 5 years of carrying it. She'd been allowed 60 seconds to hold it at the graveside. That was the rule for active duty. 60 seconds before you tuck the next one under your arm and move to the next flag and the next grieving family. She'd only taken 30 seconds for most of them. For this one, she took all 60. His name was Daniel Halloway. Petty Officer 2nd Class, Navy Corpsman, attached to 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. Her best medic. The one who never froze when blood started running and panic started spreading. The one who understood that pain was information, just data that the body was sending about what was broken. He'd taken shrapnel through the chest cavity during a medevac run near Sanjin Valley. 3rd time that month he'd gone into fire zones for extracted wounded. The 4th time he didn't come back. Katie had held his flag for exactly 60 seconds, then she'd folded it back into the plastic sleeve and filed it away with the others. 2 more. Both gone. All medics, all volunteers, all believing they could make a difference in a place that only understood force. She traced the folds in the fabric. 1, 2, 3. 60 seconds ticking down in her head like a countdown timer. She allowed herself to feel it, the weight of the flag, the memory of his face, the knowledge that she'd been pulled out of theater to do something else, something that never quite made sense until now. Watching James Chen. Watching him because someone in the Pentagon thought his replacement might know something. Thought she might find something. And she had. She'd found Dr. Mercer billing the VA for surgical procedures on combat veterans while their bodies were still healing, their minds still numb, their trust in the system absolute. 54 seconds left. The apartment was quiet except for the refrigerator's hum and the distant sound of rain starting against the windows. Norfolk rain came heavy in September, salt spray and Atlantic pressure. It drummed against the glass like applause for the dead. 42 seconds. She thought about Halloway's hands. Hands that had stopped bleeding, hands that had intubated airways, hands that had held lives together long enough to get them to the medevac chopper. Surgeon's hands, except he was a medic, and the military didn't give medals for that kind of work. They gave them in private ceremonies, flag boxes, and closed caskets. 27 seconds. Mercer had hands like that too. Surgical hands. Precise, educated, capable. He'd just decided to use them to steal. 15 seconds. Katie folded the flag carefully, exactly as it had been folded. 3 triangles. Military tight. Precision folds. She placed it back in the plastic sleeve, closed her eyes, and let the remaining seconds tick out in silence. At 60, she stood up. She put the flag back in her locker at St. Michael's. She returned to her apartment. She encrypted her laptop and secured the billing records in a classified folder on a Pentagon server she was never supposed to have accessed. Then she waited for what would come next. Corporal Chen was still in room 307. Still stable. Still unaware that someone was stealing from him while he slept. She'd been sent to protect him. She was going to finish what she started. Grand Rounds conference room at St. Michael's Hospital in Norfolk sprawled across the 4th floor like a tiered amphitheater, 20 residents and attending physicians arranged in ascending rows of blue seats, fluorescent panels casting that particular hospital light that made everyone look equally exhausted. Dr. Marcus Mercer stood at the center of the room like a conductor before an orchestra, Katie's patient chart held above his head like evidence at trial. The laser pointer in his right hand traced circles around her handwriting on the projection screen, each movement sharp and deliberate, calculated to draw every eye toward the deficiency he was about to illuminate. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mercer began, his voice carrying the smooth certainty of a man who had never once questioned his own judgment, "this is what dangerously outdated protocols look like." He turned the page slowly, letting the residents absorb each notation, each clinical decision Katie had made. "Our colleague Nurse Rodriguez here still thinks we're operating in field conditions, perhaps. Maybe she missed the memo that we have, actual medical technology now. Monitors. Labs. Real diagnostics." The residents laughed, the kind of nervous laughter that signaled they understood the hierarchy and chose to remain on the winning side of it. One of them, a third-year resident with the kind of expensive watch that screamed family money, actually shook his head as if Katie's competence was genuinely baffling to him. Katie stood at the back wall, spine straight but appearing unremarkable, the way a person becomes invisible when they choose not to demand attention. Her jaw tightened fractionally. That was all. A muscle shifted beneath the angle of her chin, a barely perceptible tension that would have gone unnoticed by anyone not trained to recognize the signs of absolute restraint. Her hands clasped behind her back, one wrist held steady by the other, and she continued reviewing medication schedules on her tablet as if Mercer's voice was simply background noise, the same background noise as the mechanical hiss of the ventilation system, the same white noise as fluorescent lights that never quite stopped humming at a frequency that only some people could hear. Her face remained blank. Not a flicker of emotion. Not a reddening cheek. Not a single tell that would have given him the satisfaction he was clearly fishing for. The other nurses in the room, those scattered throughout the tiered seating, exchanged knowing glances, the kind that passed between people who had watched this pattern repeat itself across months. Recognition. Pity. The understanding that Mercer needed someone beneath him to feel adequate within himself. 2 hours later, on the third floor near the patient vending machines that dispense vending machine food the way certain institutions dispense inevitability, Katie knelt to retrieve a dropped quarter that had rolled beneath the metal frame. The machine's compressor cycled with a metallic shudder. She was focused on the quarter, her fingers extended into the narrow gap where it had wedged, when Dr. Mercer rounded the corner with 3 residents in his wake, the same architectural arrangement of power that worked better in hallways than it did in conference rooms. He paused deliberately as he approached, timing it so that Katie remained kneeling, so that the spatial hierarchy was physically expressed in the vertical distance between his shoes and her eye level. "Maybe you should stay down there where you belong, Rodriguez," he said, loud enough that his voice traveled the full length of the corridor, loud enough that Mrs. Chen in room 312 could probably hear him through her partially closed door, loud enough that the nurses stationed 20 feet away fell into sudden silence. "It suits you." His entourage erupted in snickers, that particular brand of social currency that gets spent in moments like these, where laughter functions as agreement and agreement functions as safety. Katie's hand tightened fractionally around the quarter, knuckles whitening just enough that the small circulation change was visible if you knew what you were looking for. But she continued fishing for her change, face blank as stone, and when she finally retrieved it, she rose with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested she was simply standing up, not recovering from an insult. She pocketed the quarter and walked past Mercer without making eye contact, without acknowledging that he existed at all, which somehow made it worse for him, the complete absence of reaction more wounding than any verbal response could have been. That evening, during shift change when the hospital's energy shifted like a living thing rearranging itself, Mercer cornered her at the nurse's station. The counter stretched between them like a demarcation line. He slid a disciplinary form across the polished surface with the deliberate care of a man placing a bet he knew he would win. "I'm recommending you for remedial training," he said, his voice now pitched for professionalism, now stripped of the contempt that came so naturally to him in public. This was the administrative version of his aggression, cleaner, documented, harder to challenge. "Your charting is substandard. Your clinical judgment questionable. And frankly, I question whether you have the intellectual capacity for this work." He paused, letting that land. "The form requires your signature." Katie read the document without touching it, her eye scanning the allegations, protocol violations, concerning behavioral patterns, insufficient clinical reasoning. Every accusation was either fabricated outright or twisted beyond recognition. She picked up the pen from the counter, a cheap hospital ballpoint with the name of a pharmaceutical company stamped along the barrel, and signed her name in the space provided. Her signature was steady and unhurried, each letter formed with the same precision she used to calculate drug dosages. She returned the pen and the form to Mercer without reading it a second time, and she did not argue, did not protest, did not give him the satisfaction of a response. "Thank you for the input, Doctor," she said quietly, the words emerging without inflection, and she turned and walked toward Corporal Chen's room. The door closed behind her with a soft hydraulic hiss. For exactly 60 seconds, Katie allowed her hands to shake. Just her hands. Nothing else. No breathing change, no trembling in her legs, no tears that needed blinking back. Her hands shook as if they were separate entities rebelling against her control, and she pressed them flat against the cool laminate of the bedside table until the tremor subsided and the muscle memory of discipline reasserted itself. The shock had passed. The anger had been processed through a system that had learned, over 18 years and 4 tours and countless indignities, to convert rage into fuel instead of reaction. Shaking stopped. Hands locked steady again. 60 seconds of vulnerability ended, and the captain returned to the surface, the way she always did. The next morning, security radios crackled with unusual frequency throughout the hospital. Katie heard the transmission while she was reviewing Chen's post-operative notes on the second floor. "All units, be advised, nursing staff assignment change in effect immediately. Additional personnel assigned to Shadow Nurse Rodriguez on rounds. Supervisory observance only. No clinical intervention necessary." The message was technically about patient safety. It sounded professional and measured. But what it actually meant was that 2 security officers appeared within 10 minutes, both with the bearing of people who had been given a specific assignment and the lack of context that made them neither sympathetic to the target nor hostile, simply present. Functional instruments of institutional pressure. Katie's entire shift became a performance conducted under observation. The guards followed her from patient room to patient room, their shoes clicking against the tile in synchronization with her own footsteps. The nursing staff, picking up on the subtext, became distant, not hostile, just cautious. Mrs. Patterson, who usually asked Katie how her morning was going, simply handed her the vitals clipboard. Marcus, the ER tech who usually cracked jokes during the supply run, suddenly became focused entirely on counting gauze packs. The isolation was not total and not explicit. It was institutional and perfect and designed to communicate that Katie was now operating outside of normal social structures. But that wasn't the worst part. That afternoon, Katie slipped into an empty conference room on the 5th floor and pulled up her encrypted Pentagon email on the hospital's unsecured Wi-Fi, rerouted through 3 proxy servers. The VA billing record she had been photographing for 3 weeks now filled her encrypted folder, hundreds of pages arranged by patient, by procedure, by authorization date. She cross-referenced the names methodically, her hands moving across the keyboard with the kind of speed that came from years of conducting threat assessments. Corporal James Chen's file showed 17 post-operative procedures documented in the system. The surgical site notes indicated he had undergone only 4. The phantom procedures, spinal taps, bronchoscopies, cardiac imaging, were all billed at premium rates, all authorized by Dr. Mercer's access codes, all routed through a private billing company that forwarded payments to a numbered account in Delaware. Sergeant Martinez showed 3 bronchoscopies he never received. Staff Sergeant Williams carried charges for cardiac catheterizations that never happened, but Mercer's documentation claimed they did, claimed they were necessary, claimed they had been performed at specific times that contradicted hospital logs. The pattern emerged from the data like a constellation revealing itself against darkness, $2.3 million in phantom procedures across 18 months, all targeting veterans whose cases were too complex for them to navigate, too traumatic for them to scrutinize medical bills, too isolated by their service to hire lawyers who might notice. Katie photographed each page, each spreadsheet analysis, each cross-reference she had compiled. She uploaded the encrypted files to a secure Pentagon server that she accessed through the same proxy network, and within 30 minutes, she received a 2-word response in an email that would be automatically deleted, maintain cover. The next morning, Dr. Mercer arrived at St. Michael's at 5:22 a.m., before the hospital fully woke, and went directly to the administrative offices on the third floor where hospital board chair Gregory Williamson kept an office that overlooked the parking lot like a watchtower. Mercer had helped place both of Williamson's children into prestigious residency programs, had written letters of recommendation that emphasized strengths those candidates didn't actually possess, had leveraged his influence and reputation to open doors that would have remained closed. Williamson owed him in the way that powerful men owe other powerful men, in silence and cooperation. They sat across from each other in leather chairs while the city of Norfolk slowly brightened beyond the windows. Mercer slid fabricated incident reports across the mahogany desk, documents that referenced Katie's insubordination, her protocol violations, her concerning behavioral patterns. He had doctored her personnel file over the last 2 days, minor adjustments that told a compelling story if you weren't looking too closely at the facts underneath. "She's a liability," Mercer said, his voice steady and reasonable, the voice of a man presenting obvious truths to another man of status. "Her judgment is questionable. I have concerns about her mental stability." He paused, letting that land. "And she's been accessing patient files well outside her scope." Williamson nodded slowly, the way board chairs nod when they understand that paperwork is about to become necessary. "What do you need?" "Her termination," Mercer said simply. "Clean and documented. No lawsuit exposure." That same morning, Mercer contacted the staffing agency that had placed Katie, the one with Pentagon connections so deep they were invisible to ordinary scrutiny. He spoke to her previous employers, Pentagon liaison officers trained to give vague answers that could be spun into whatever narrative needed spinning. "Has Ms. Rodriguez shown any concerning patterns in previous placements?" he asked, his voice warm and collegial, the voice of one professional consulting with another. The liaison, caught off guard by the direct question and bound by operational security, gave responses that were technically truthful but contextually misleading. Yes, she had transferred between positions frequently. No, there had never been complaints, but the liaisons couldn't discuss the specifics of classified placements. The evasiveness sounded like confirmation to Mercer's ear, and he documented it as evidence of inconsistent employment history. By mid-afternoon, Mercer brought in Patricia Foam from an external HR consulting firm, a woman known throughout the hospital system for aggressive termination cases, for files built so tightly they could withstand any legal scrutiny. She reviewed the documents Mercer had prepared, her expression neutral and professional as she assessed the case. "I need a clean file," Mercer told her, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who had maneuvered others out of institutions before. "No lawsuit exposure. And it needs to happen quickly. She's becoming a problem." Foam nodded, making notes. She had built termination cases on less. She had ended careers on whispers and innuendo properly documented. This was her skill set, taking the shadows of institutional discomfort and transforming them into the appearance of objective fact. What happened next would unfold across the remaining hours before Katie's shift ended, the kind of institutional machinery that moves silently until the moment it strikes. Katie understood, watching from a distance, that she was being maneuvered off the board systematically, that Mercer had activated every lever available to him, that her cover was in active danger of being blown not by exposure of her military service but by simple termination from the hospital itself, which would end her access to the VA records and to Corporal Chen before she could document the final piece of evidence. Chen's post-operative follow-up examination was scheduled for tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. That was her last window. After that, Mercer could alter records, adjust documentation, make evidence disappear into the same administrative silence that had hidden his theft for 18 months. Katie reviewed her options with the analytical precision of someone who had planned operations with narrower margins than this. She had 23 hours. She had access to every file, every record, every piece of documentation necessary. And she had the training to accomplish what needed accomplishing under maximum pressure, in the presence of witnesses, while maintaining the appearance of a nursing professional simply doing her job. Katie found the file at 2:43 p.m. on a Tuesday, buried 3 layers deep in the electronic medical records system where most nurses never looked. Corporal James Chen. Examination Room 4. Patient history flagged for routine post-operative follow-up after shrapnel removal. She scrolled through the billing codes with the methodical precision of someone trained to see patterns others missed, and there they were, 7 procedures. Imaging studies that showed no corresponding radiographs. Surgical consultations with no documentation. For therapies logged but never dispensed. The phantom procedures stacked up like evidence at a crime scene, each one a small theft, each one adding up to $43,000 billed directly to the VA, $43,000 for procedures that never happened on a veteran who'd already sacrificed enough. Katie's jaw tightened. Not from anger. Anger was a luxury she'd abandoned in Kandahar, but from clarity. Dr. Mercer knew she was looking. He knew the exact depth of her investigation, and he was accelerating something. A counterattack. A dismantling. She could feel it the way she used to feel incoming mortars, that particular pressure change in the air that meant the situation had moved past subtle and into desperate. Her phone buzzed at 3:15 p.m. Dr. Mercer's voice on the hospital intercom, requesting her presence in his office. She didn't move. Not yet. She finished her charting, documented the vital signs she'd collected from 3 other patients, and didn't respond until she'd achieved complete composure, the kind that comes from having already survived worse. Then she walked downstairs with her badge clipped at precisely the right angle and her scrubs unstained and her expression neutral as a stone. Mercer's office smelled like leather furniture and expensive cologne, the scent of a man who'd never worried about money. He sat behind his desk with his computer screen angled away from view, and before Katie even closed the door, she heard him on his phone, voice low and practiced, the tone of someone calling in favors. "Yes, I'm aware of your position on residency recommendations," he was saying. "I'm simply suggesting that the one I provided for your program in 2018, remember, when you were struggling to meet accreditation standards, well, that recommendation carried significant weight with the review board. I wouldn't want any misunderstandings about my role in that process." A pause. His smile was a knife. "Exactly. I knew you'd understand. There's a nurse here, Katie Rodriguez, working in critical care. I need her references checked. Thoroughly. The temp agency she came through, I want to know everything. Employment history, background verification, all of it. And I need it done quietly, before the end of business tomorrow." Katie didn't move. Didn't breathe differently. Her face remained a mask of patient waiting, the expression of someone used to standing quietly while doctors made decisions. But her mind was already calculating. He was calling in institutional leverage, using past favors to weaponize bureaucracy. Pentagon-manufactured cover stories were designed to withstand cursory background checks, but they weren't built for aggressive scrutiny from someone with the right connections. By 4:36 p.m., Katie's phone had received a call from the temp agency director, her voice apologetic and confused. "Katie, I'm not sure what's happening, but St. Michael's HR just requested a full re-verification of your employment history. They're asking about your previous assignments, your background check, your references from before you came to us. It's unusual. Is everything okay?" Katie had assured her it was fine, just routine vetting. She'd hung up and sat in the break room with a cup of coffee she didn't drink, understanding that Mercer had moved past public humiliation into institutional sabotage. Examination room for held Corporal James Chen at 5:19 p.m., shirtless on the examination table, his chest a roadmap of scars, the kind only Kandahar could write. Shrapnel marks, surgical scars, the white lines of tissue that marked where a combat medic had dug metal fragments out of bone and muscle while rounds snapped overhead. This man had taken Chen's place. This man had done Katie's job. This man was why she was here, why she'd left her son with her sister for 6 months, why she'd accepted the role of invisible nurse in a Norfolk hospital. "How's the pain?" Katie asked, placing her hand against his chest to feel his heart rate, assessing the surgical site where Mercer had removed the remaining shrapnel fragments 2 weeks prior. "Manageable," Chen lied, the way Marines always do, the way Katie used to lie when asked the same question. His heart rate was elevated, 104 beats per minute. His skin was warm. Katie palpated the surgical site and felt it immediately, heat, swelling, fluid accumulated beneath scar tissue like a pressure cooker building toward rupture. Infection, probably. Mercer's post-operative wound care had been perfunctory at best, negligent at worst. Katie reached for the phone to call for imaging, for ultrasound, for someone with actual competence to assess the developing hematoma when Chen's eyes rolled backward and his body went rigid. The surgical site didn't rupture so much as explode. Blood sprayed across the examination table in arterial pulses, bright and crimson and absolutely catastrophic. Mercer's sloppy surgical closure had failed under the pressure of internal infection and fluid accumulation. Chen's pressure dropped before Katie even reached him. She could hear it in his gasping breath, see it in the grey-white pallor spreading across his face like spilled paint. His core temperature was rising, his body going into septic shock, his blood pressure bottoming out as internal hemorrhage flooded his chest cavity at a rate that meant he had minutes, maybe less. Katie slammed the code button without hesitation and yanked open the crash cart with the kind of violence that made the medical resident in the doorway flinch backward. She didn't wait for orders, didn't wait for the code team to assemble, didn't wait for someone else to take the lead. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory from 17 years, 9 of them in active combat, 5 of them doing emergency medicine under the kind of pressure that separated competent from miraculous. She poured betadine across Chen's chest in a broad swath and reached for a scalpel. Not the surgical scalpel, the combat trauma shear was in her pocket, carried like a talisman since Kandahar, engraved with a call sign she'd earned and buried years ago. She drew it instead and made the incision with the controlled violence of someone who'd done this under mortar fire, between the 4th and 5th ribs, left anterolateral thoracotomy, the textbook approach except there was no textbook when your patient was bleeding out and your only tool was the scalpel in your hand and the knowledge written into your muscle memory. Her hand disappeared into Chen's chest cavity up to her wrist, blood-warm and pulsing across her forearms as she found his heart, a fist-sized muscle that had stopped its rhythm and started into irregular desperation. She began manual cardiac massage, her fingers performing compressions in the rhythm she'd learned, taught, perfected, push, release, the mechanical motion of keeping blood flowing to a brain that was already dying from lack of oxygen. Epi, now, she barked at the frozen resident. Her voice had dropped 2 octaves. The deferential cadence of the invisible nurse was gone, replaced by command authority that made seasoned ER attendings jump without questioning. Push 1 milligram 4. Hang 2 units O negative, type and cross for 4 more. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath and vascular clamp, I need reperfusion control right now. And if you're not moving in 3 seconds, get out of my trauma bay. The ER exploded into motion. Nurses who'd been standing motionless suddenly became hydraulic machines, drawing medications, pushing compressions on the code cart, establishing access points. Someone pushed a tray toward Katie. She didn't break rhythm, didn't pause her manual cardiac massage, just called out orders while her hand kept Chen's heart functioning, kept blood moving through vessels that would have stopped entirely without her intervention. 6 minutes into the code, Dr. Mercer arrived in the doorway and stopped cold. He saw Katie wrist deep in Chen's chest cavity, her face splattered with blood that had sprayed during the initial rupture, her body moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done emergency trauma surgery in far worse conditions than a sterile examination room. He saw the way the medical residents responded to her voice, the way the attending ER physician had ceded the code to her without argument, the way her presence made the air pressure change, as if a door had opened into a different kind of authority entirely. Mercer's face went white. Not with relief at seeing a patient being saved. With rage. With recognition that Katie Rodriguez had just revealed something he desperately needed hidden, had just demonstrated competence and command authority that no temporary nurse at a community hospital was supposed to possess, had just exposed herself in precisely the way that made his entire scheme vulnerable. Katie's eyes met his for 1/2 second while her hand continued its mechanical rhythm inside Chen's chest. She held his gaze with the calm of someone who'd already accepted the consequences, and in that moment, she understood, Dr. Mercer's counterattack had just accelerated exponentially. The Pentagon cover would be questioned. Her references would be scrutinized. Her unknown history would become the target of institutional investigation. She had maybe 36 hours before everything unraveled. But Chen's oxygen saturation was climbing. 84%. 90%. The residents were establishing a surgical team to get him to the operating room, to repair the damage that Mercer's negligence had caused, to give him a chance at the life he'd already fought so hard to keep. And that, Katie understood as she finally released the cardiac massage and stepped back to let the surgical team take over, was worth whatever came next. Corporal Chen's heart was failing. Katie's hand was inside his chest. The surgical team materialized around her like a choreographed unit, the vascular surgeon, 2 residents, a perfusionist already prepping the bypass cart. Nobody questioned her presence. Nobody asked her credentials. They saw a woman with her hand wrapped around a human heart, performing cardiac massage with the precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before, and they simply moved into formation around her. Squeeze, the vascular surgeon said, not a question. He was examining her hand placement, the angle of her fingers against the ventricle, the way her palm compressed and released in rhythm with her barked commands. His eyes narrowed. He didn't take over. He assisted. I need a 4.0 silk suture, Katie said, her voice dropping 2 octaves. And someone get me warm saline. Core temps dropping. The resident jumped. The nurse ran. Blood dripped from Katie's forearm onto the floor in a rhythm that matched the monitor, beep, drip, drip, a percussion of crisis and control. 70 seconds into the thoracotomy, Chen's rhythm began stabilizing. The monitor showed improvement, 68 beats per minute. Then 72. Then 85, climbing toward something resembling normal. Pressure's rising, someone called out. Katie didn't acknowledge it. Her eyes were fixed on Chen's open chest cavity, on the placement of the vascular clamp she'd positioned to stop the hemorrhage, on the subtle movements her fingers made to maintain perfusion. Combat training didn't just teach you how to save a life in 30 seconds. It taught you how to hold one in your hands without trembling, how to trust muscle memory when your mind couldn't afford to doubt, how to make impossible decisions look routine. 20 minutes later, Chen was intubated, stable, his heart beating on its own again. An ICU nurse prepared the ventilator settings while residents prepared for transport. Katie stepped back from the examination table, her hands dropping to her sides. Blood covered her scrubs from collar to hip. She looked like she'd been dipped in red. She calmly began cleaning instruments. Scalpel into the biohazard container. Clamps into the surgical tray. Gauze into the waste bin. As if she'd just completed routine paperwork. As if she hadn't just performed a procedure that required a medical license, a surgical credential, years of training, and the kind of combat experience most surgeons only read about in classified briefings. The door to the examination room opened. Dr. Mercer stood in the frame, and Katie saw something in his face that made her understand everything at once. It wasn't relief. It wasn't gratitude. It was rage. The white-hot, barely contained fury of a man who'd just watched his cover blow apart in real time. My office. Now, Mercer said. Katie finished placing the last instrument. She pulled off her gloves. She met his eyes with the flat stare of someone who'd already survived worse than anything this moment could offer. His office was small and meticulously organized, the desk clear except for a computer monitor and a nameplate that read Dr. Marcus Mercer, Chief of Surgical Services. Mercer didn't sit. He stood behind his desk with his hands gripping the edge, his knuckles white. You just performed a surgical procedure without authorization, he said, his voice low and controlled. Without supervision. Without credentials. You're done. The patient is alive, Katie said. The patient status is irrelevant to your gross violation of scope of practice, Mercer snapped. You just practice medicine without a license. That's a felony. I'm calling the board. I'm calling the state licensing board. I'm calling, he stopped himself. His eyes narrowed. You know what? I'm not calling anyone. Because I already made those calls. 30 minutes ago. Before you decided to play surgeon. Katie's face showed nothing. Not a flicker. Not a breath. Composure like a wall built from concrete and will. Mercer's voice dropped. Your references from the temp agency are being contacted as we speak. They're inconsistent. Your employment history doesn't match. The investigators are already asking questions about where you came from." He smiled, and the smile was the smile of a man who believed he'd just won. "By the time you leave this hospital, you won't have a job, you won't have credentials, and you won't have a single institution willing to hire you. You'll be radioactive." Katie didn't move. She didn't respond. She simply stood there, and her silence was louder than anything she could have said. "Get out," Mercer said, "before I have security remove you." 2 security guards escorted her to her locker. They watched as she opened the metal door and began removing her personal items. There wasn't much. A textbook she'd never opened. A pen. At the back of the locker, carefully folded, was the fabric triangle from her fallen team member's funeral, the flag that had draped the casket of someone she'd trained beside, bled beside, buried beside. She pulled it out with both hands and stared at it for 3 seconds. Just 3 seconds. Then she placed it carefully into the cardboard box that the security guard handed her. A cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" went in next. She'd bought it at a hospital gift shop on her second day, as a reminder that the cover had to be complete, had to be real. Then a dying succulent. Then a photo of her Marine team in Kandahar, 12 faces, and 3 of them circled in permanent marker, names written underneath in her own handwriting. Names of people who would never leave Afghanistan. Names of people who died so that people like Corporal Chen could live. The walk through the hospital lobby was silent. Staff members who'd watched her perform that thoracotomy now looked away. A resident who'd assisted her surgical procedure suddenly became very interested in a computer screen. Nobody made eye contact. Nobody said goodbye. She was already a ghost. Rain had begun outside, heavy and relentless, the kind that turned Norfolk parking lots into rivers. Katie sat at the bus stop bench, the cardboard box balanced on her knees, and she didn't move. Water soaked through the cardboard. Her uniform was still stained with Chen's blood. Her hands, which minutes ago had held a human heart and kept it beating, were now folded on top of the box, steady as stone. 45 minutes passed. The rain got worse. A woman walked by with an umbrella and looked away. A man in a business suit hurried past without slowing. The bus came and went because Katie didn't flag it. She just sat there, in the rain, in the silence, while her mission fell apart and her cover evaporated and everything she'd come here to accomplish turned to ash. Then she heard running footsteps. A 17-year-old boy burst around the corner, rain-soaked and breathless, his shoes splashing through puddles. He was carrying something in both hands like it was made of glass, a shadow box, wooden frame, glass front. Even from a distance, Katie could see the glint of metal inside. The glint of medals. The glint of a past she'd sealed away in classified briefings and buried under layers of just a nurse. "Mom," Marcus gasped, stopping in front of the bench. "They need to see these." Katie reached for him, reached to stop him, but Marcus was already turning, already running back toward the hospital entrance. The automatic doors slid open. He disappeared inside. Katie's hand froze halfway. For 2 seconds, she didn't move. Then she set the cardboard box on the bench, abandoned in the rain, and she moved. Her walk became purposeful. Her pace quickened. Her shoulders straightened. By the time she reached the automatic doors, she was moving like someone who'd just remembered who she was. The hospital lobby was crowded. Patients, visitors, staff, security. Corporal Chen sat in a wheelchair near the elevator, the pole rattling beside him, his surgical gown visible beneath a hasty blanket. He'd insisted on coming down against every post-op protocol, and nobody had stopped him, because when a Marine gives an order, even a wounded one, people listen. Marcus held the shadow box up to Chen's face. Chen's eyes focused on the medals, on the ribbons, on the citations typed on the mounting cards. Then he looked up. He looked past Marcus. He looked directly at Katie Rodriguez standing in the doorway. His mouth fell open. "Reaper 6, he whispered hoarsely, his voice carrying through the sudden silence that had descended on the lobby. "Oh my God! You're Reaper 6. The room went dead silent. A Marine colonel who'd been visiting the VA wing stopped mid-stride. He turned. He saw the shadow box in Marcus's hands. He saw the medals inside. He stepped forward with the precision of military bearing, took the shadow box, and began reading the citation aloud in a voice that could reach the back of a parade ground. For extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Kandahar province, Captain Katie Rodriguez repeatedly exposed herself to enemy fire to evacuate wounded personnel, personally carrying 8 casualties across 400 meters of active engagement zone. Staff members emerged from offices. Nurses left their stations. Visitors paused. Phones rose. The citation continued, each word landing like artillery: Bronze Star, Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts. A 2-star general who'd been touring the VA wing pushed through the gathering crowd. He saw the medals. He saw the ribbons. He came to immediate attention and rendered a salute, a fist placed over his heart, the gesture of one warrior acknowledging another. "Captain," he said formally. "Sir," Katie responded automatically, her posture shifting to parade rest, her voice dropping to the register of someone accustomed to command. The room shifted. Every eye in the lobby turned toward her. Every understanding rewrote itself in real time. Dr. Mercer shoved through the crowd, his face flushed with something that looked like panic. "This is highly irregular. She's been terminated for gross violations of..." His voice died as a woman in a dark suit stepped forward. Her badge was visible. Her presence was federal. "Captain Rodriguez has been operating under classified orders from the Department of Defense," the woman said quietly, but her voice carried to every corner. "You've just compromised a DOD integrity investigation into VA billing fraud, Dr. Mercer." Katie watched his face drain of color. Watched understanding settle on him like gravity. Watched him realize that he'd made a calculation error so catastrophic that it would eventually cost him everything. She sat at the bus stop in the rain with a cardboard box balanced on her knees. The kind of box that used to hold reams of printer paper, now containing the inventory of a life that wasn't supposed to end like this. Inside, a mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" with a chip on the rim she'd never bothered to repair. A dying succulent in a ceramic pot, its leaves curled like hands retreating from pain. And a photograph, worn at the edges, of her Kandahar team standing in front of a Humvee, their faces sunburned and laughing, 3 of them circled in permanent marker. 3 names she couldn't say out loud anymore without her hands steadying themselves against something solid. Rain hammered the bus shelter like applause nobody wanted. Her scrubs were still damp from the security escort out of St. Michael's. Her badge had been cut from the lanyard and handed back to her with the kind of finality that made it clear nobody was offering a second chance. 48 hours ago, she'd been undercover, one surgical intervention away from nailing Mercer's phantom billing scheme. Now she was unemployed, her cover blown, her mission in free fall, and Corporal James Chen was still in recovery with her hands being the last memory he had before they loaded him onto the gurney. The bus was 12 minutes late. She knew because she'd been counting. That's when Marcus arrived. He came around the corner at a run, his Drotk uniform plastered to his frame, soaked through, his 17-year-old face flushed with something between anger and purpose. His breath came in bursts as he skidded to a stop in front of her, rain streaming off his dark hair, eyes locked on hers with the kind of intensity that reminded her exactly who his mother was. Mom. One word. Breathless. Katie didn't move the box. Didn't speak. The composure held. Always held. Marcus thrust something toward her. A shadow box. Black mahogany frame, glass face, felt backing in navy blue. And mounted on that felt, arranged in ascending order, were the medals. Bronze Star ribbons. Silver Star ribbons, the one that glinted like liquid mercury even under the rain-blurred shelter light. 2 Purple Hearts with their distinctive purple silk. And at the bottom, the one that made her stomach clench, the one she'd buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself it didn't exist anymore, the Navy Cross. "They need to see these," Marcus said, his voice steady in a way that told her this wasn't teenage rebellion, this was a young man who'd made a decision. "They need to know what you are." Katie looked at her son. Rain dripped from his nose. His uniform was coming apart at the seams from the pace he'd run. He was magnificent. "Marcus! Come on." He didn't wait for permission. He turned and started back toward the hospital. Katie set the cardboard box on the bench, gently, as if it were made of something more fragile than cardboard, and followed her son back into the place they'd just thrown her out of. The lobby of St. Michael's was quiet for a Thursday afternoon. A few visitors scattered across uncomfortable chairs. A patient in a wheelchair being pushed by an aide toward the orthopedic ward. The front desk staffed by the same woman who'd processed Katie's termination paperwork 2 hours earlier, the woman who'd had the decency to look ashamed. Marcus strode past all of it. His drock uniform gave him authority that his aide should have denied him. He moved toward the elevator bank with the kind of purpose that made people get out of his way. That's when the lobby doors from the patient wards burst open. Corporal James Chen was being wheeled out in a transport chair, his surgical gown hanging loose off his bandaged frame, his fur-stand rattling against the chair arm as a very angry charge nurse tried to steer him back through the doors. Chen was having none of it. His face was pale, his stitches still angry red, but his eyes had locked onto Katie the moment she stepped into the lobby, and they widened with a recognition that transcended name and rank and everything else. "Reaper 6, Chen whispered. Not a question. A statement. A prayer." The words landed like a defibrillator paddle in the middle of a flat-lined room. Everyone stopped. The charge nurse paused mid-push. A visitor lowered her magazine. The woman at the front desk's fingers froze over her keyboard. The fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent hum, utterly unconcerned with the seismic shift happening beneath them. Chen's eyes filled with tears. "Oh my God. Oh my God, you're Reaper 6. Katie didn't move. Didn't flinch. But her hands that had held his chest cavity together, that had felt his heart flutter back to life under her palms, her hands steadied themselves at her sides with the precision of someone who'd practiced this exact moment 1,000 times in dark apartments at 3 in the morning. Footsteps echoed across the lobby tile. They came from the administrative wing, sharp, authoritative, the gait of someone accustomed to command. A man in a suit that cost more than Katie's monthly apartment rent materialized beside Chen's wheelchair. Not military dress, but something that moved like military bearing. Government. Federal. The kind of presence that made the air pressure in a room recalibrate. "Corporal Chen, you should be resting," the man said, but his eyes were fixed on Dr. Mercer, who'd emerged from the patient ward behind the charge nurse, his face contorting as he processed what he was seeing, his fired employee, standing in his lobby, next to a dying vet he'd just tried to use as cover for his fraud scheme, and now there was a federal operative stepping forward with the kind of calm that preceded the end of empires. "Dr. Mercer." The suit's voice was quiet. Conversational, almost. The kind of quiet that precedes thunder. "Captain Rodriguez has been operating under classified DOD orders for the past 6 months. She's been investigating a VA billing fraud scheme in this hospital, and you've just compromised an active federal integrity investigation by attempting to destroy a superior officer's career and credibility in order to obstruct her work." Mercer's face didn't just drain of color. It sort of deflated. Like someone had opened a valve and let out everything that had been holding him upright. "That's not, I didn't," she was. "It wasn't a question, Doctor. It was a statement of fact. And a heads up that the FBI is executing search warrants on your home and office as we speak. You'll want to have a lawyer meet you there." The suit turned to Katie. Nodded once, a gesture of respect that carried the weight of institutions and clearances and years of service all compressed into a single movement. "Captain." "Sir," Katie said. Her voice had dropped an octave. The deferential nurse was gone. What remained was someone who'd survived Kandahar, who'd held dying Marines in her hands, who'd chosen to hide in scrubs and obscurity because the mission was bigger than recognition. "Corporal Chen." "Stable," Chen said, his words trembling with something that wasn't weakness. It was the tremor of understanding. You saved my life. You actually. I did my job, Katie said. But by then, 12 different phones in the lobby had captured the federal liaison's revelation. 12 different angles of Mercer's face crumpling like discarded paper. 12 different recordings of Chen's whisper, Reaper 6, oh my God, you're Reaper 6. By evening, the videos had 40,000 views. By midnight, they'd crested 300,000. By the next morning, they'd gone absolutely viral. The algorithm had seized on them like a living thing, and by the time Katie was sitting in her apartment with Marcus making coffee in her kitchen, the video had crossed 4 million views and was climbing. But that wasn't what ended Dr. Mercer's career. Not really. That came at 1 a.m. when his phone rang in his house in the suburbs, in the bedroom where his wife was already pretending to sleep, where she'd been pretending to sleep for 3 months, where she was already calculating how much she'd get in the divorce. Dr. Harrison Cole's voice came through the phone like winter itself. Navy surgeon. Medal of Honor recipient. The man who'd mentored Christopher Mercer through medical school 20 years ago, who'd written the letters that launched his career, who'd believed in him when he was just an ambitious resident with steady hands and, apparently, the ethics of a vulture. I taught you to heal, Cole said, and his voice was the temperature of outer space. I taught you that medicine was service. That every patient was sacred. Especially those who served. And you used it to steal from veterans. You tried to destroy a Silver Star recipient for doing her duty. Mercer tried to speak. Tried to mount some defense, some mitigation, some excuse that might land in the space between the words. Cole cut him off. I'm testifying against you to the state medical board. Every letter I ever wrote for you, I'm retracting personally. And Christopher, don't ever call yourself my student again. The line went dead. Within 48 hours, the Virginia Board of Medicine had convened an emergency hearing. Gregory Williamson, the hospital board chair who'd leveraged his power to fire Katie, resigned before he could be subpoenaed. The temp agency that had provided Katie's cover revealed it had been contacted by federal investigators 6 months ago. Patricia Fong's own records were audited, exposing she'd fabricated termination cases for 3 other employees who'd questioned Mercer's billing practices. St. Michael's placed Mercer on immediate suspension. The state medical board reviewed Dr. Cole's testimony alongside 17 documented instances of fraudulent billing, witness intimidation, and patient care interference. They presented Mercer with the evidence. His attorney negotiated for 40 minutes before understanding there was no exit ramp, no plea that would spare him from the fundamental truth: he'd been caught stealing from veterans, and he'd tried to destroy a military officer to cover it up. They stripped his medical license. They revoked his hospital privileges. Federal prosecutors filed criminal charges. His wife filed for divorce. His country club revoked his membership. Within 6 weeks, he was living in a studio apartment in a part of Norfolk where the walls were thin and the neighbors didn't ask questions. Then, because the universe has a sense of timing that borders on poetic, the community college advertised a part-time position teaching basic life support and CPR certification. The pay was $15 an hour. Mercer took it because it was the only place that would hire him. 6 months later, Katie Rodriguez stood in the rose garden in her dress blues, ribbons bright against navy fabric, Marcus beside her in his own dress uniform. The president shook her hand. Corporal Chen stood in the audience wearing his own blues, saluting. And across town, in a fluorescent-lit classroom at Norfolk Community College, Dr. Mercer stood before 30 bored students, demonstrating CPR compression rhythms on a plastic dummy. His hands that had signed off on fraudulent procedures, that had pointed at patient charts in contempt, that had tried to bury evidence, pressed down on lifeless plastic in the same mechanical rhythm he'd once taught to residents who'd erased his name from their professional bias. A student raised her hand. Weren't you, like, a real doctor or something? Mercer's jaw tightened. Just practice your compressions. That evening, the video of the Rose Garden ceremony played on the evening news. Katie's voice carried through the audio, steady and clear: power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. And those who understand that, who live that, they're the ones the world overlooks until the moment we need them most. And then we finally see. Mercer watched it on his phone in his car before his evening shift teaching first aid certification. And for the first time, he understood exactly what he'd destroyed and exactly what he'd never had. If you made it this far, you already know the real heroes don't wear their uniforms to work. They hide them. Please like, subscribe, and comment with stories of people you've underestimated who turned out to be extraordinary. And if you've witnessed medical fraud or billing schemes targeting veterans, report it to the VA Office of Inspector General, because there are still people out there watching, still people with nothing left to lose, and they're still fighting for those who served.